Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to Painless Universal, a conversation with myself and Welsh. Today we'll be talking about narcissists, love toxic relationship, codependency, addiction, and many more. Why? Have you ever asked yourself, why are you in an addictive relationship? Why do you feel the urge to keep going shopping? Why are you codependent on somebody? What's happened in your past? What's have actually happened now that's led you to this path? Well, my guest today will be answering that question. She'll be telling us about her own journey, her background, and what led her on this path to find her true self. To understand these pains we go through, especially the relationship pain, and how we could find our joy again. Let me tell you a little bit about my guest. Well, Sherry Gaba is a certified recovering coach specializing in individual coach, couples, family, and group psychotherapy. She maintains a private practice in Westlake Village, California, as well as providing phone and Skype appointments. She has over 20 years of experience in the clinical and a graduate of USC, specialist in addiction, relationship, codependency, trauma, parenting, divorce, and single parenting. She currently serves as a private practitioner working with a broad spectrum of clients. I will be talking to her about her work. She's worked with numerous people around LA, around the United States. And why is it so important that when you notice such signs, you get help immediately? You get out of that relationship and start getting the help. By listening to her conversation, you understand what are the signs and how to get the help you deserve. One exciting thing about Sherry before we get her on board is that she was the go-to expert for Dr. Drew Pinsky's Celebrity Rehab show on VH1, or later the spin-off Celebrity Rehab Sex Addiction. Let's meet our amazing guest, Sherry Gaba, as she tells us her journey, and we have this amazing conversation. Sit back and enjoy. Meet Sherry. Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to Painless Universal, a conversation with myself and Welsh. Today's conversation is one I truly think you can't miss. We talk about all issue codependency, love, relationship, things that we've all been through, especially during the pandemic. A lot of people have questioned themselves, should I still be in this relationship? It's not really working. My guest today, Sherry Gaba, will be just telling you about her own story, her own journey, and what she does. Sherry, how are you today?
Good, Anne. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everything you're doing in the world. Yeah, you asked me, who am I? So,
Absolutely.
what? Okay, that's a great question. I think we all should be asking ourselves that question: who are we, and who are we connected to, and are we connected to ourselves? Because at the root of love and relationship addiction is a lack of connection with oneself. There's a lot of noise out there about narcissistic abuse and getting into toxic relationships. And I know we're going to get into that, but it really starts with ourselves. And so my story began as a preemie. I was 2.5 months early. And at that time, mothers were not allowed to bond with their children. I didn't meet my mother for 2.5 months. I was in an incubator. I was being fed through my feet. With oxygen over my nose. And so I developed quite a bit of separation anxiety and anxious attachment issues and abandonment issues. And that really was the root of why I had many adult relationships that did not work out, because I hadn't resolved that early issue. So I even talk about it in my book called Love Smacked, which is on Amazon. And it talks about my journey of love addiction and multiple relationships that didn't work out. But my dream and goal is to really eradicate the stigma around multiple relationships, whether you've been married multiple times or you've been in lots of relationships, to really stop calling them failures, because they're not failures. There are reasons for it. And I think we'll get into that in our conversation about early trauma, early childhood neglect and abandonment and so forth, that causes us to later have these really, unhealthy, toxic relationships. And
Mm.
so for me, love addiction and codependency became my go-to. And these are process addictions, and anybody can have a process addiction, especially when they grow up with this early trauma. You could be a binge eater, you could have a sex addiction, you could be a food addict, you could be a binge eater, an internet addict, a gaming addict, a workaholic, a shopping addict, a spending addict, a debting addict. I mean, the mood goes on, and really it's the same mood altering activity and behavior that's really identical to any euphoric state that even a substance could provide. So you get that high. So for me, my first love was my first addiction, my first high, and that set me up to that state of wanting that high. But you can never get that high again. Just like an addict, they always talk about their first high, and they're chasing that high for the rest of their life.
Mm.
But what's so hard about that love addiction high is that if a breakup occurs, well, the addictive lover, myself, love addict, relationship addict, will be searching for that attachment over and over again, and that pleasurable feeling of that lost relationship, just like a drug user is craving their drug.
Wow. When you talk about this, in your background, when you look back at your life, I know you said you had and you were born preemie, but what in your background led you on this path to think that, to start helping others? Because you've obviously been through this path, but when did you decide that, okay, I need to give my energy to other people to help them with going through whatever challenges they're going through? When did you realize you wanted to do this?
Well, I became a therapist, let's see, 34, about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Wait, is it 30 years? Yeah, 30 years ago, I started school. I'm sorry. I've been a licensed therapist for 20 years.
Mm.
And my original goal was to work with single mothers, because I was a single mom. My ex-husband, my baby's dad, left when my daughter was a year old. And it was very challenging, but a lot of people helped me. And I thought, I think I could help others too with everything that I have learned. And that was just the beginning of my journey. And then the way I got into this love addiction, so-called platform, is because I had married an alcoholic, divorced an alcoholic, and my whole brand was about helping other addicts. I ended up on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew Pinsky. He's a very famous doctor out here in the States, and he had his own show, Celebrity Rehab. And so I was helping all these addicts and alcoholics, trying to save my marriage, trying to, basically fix, manipulate, and control my alcoholic ex. And I realized my life's out of control. I am obsessed with him. He's obsessed with over alcohol, and I need help. We eventually divorced, and that began my journey of getting a therapist, working on trauma, and really becoming the best person that I could be, the highest version of myself, and really help others that have been through the same thing. And that's what makes, I think, my work so powerful, is that I've not only been there, but I'm also a professional licensed therapist. So it sort of said, God, here I am helping all these addicts, alcoholics. How codependent is that? I want to help me, and I want to help others that are dealing with being addicted to an addict or a narcissist, or have found themselves in these toxic relationships, and to really get underneath what is that reason that is happening over and over again for people, and to eradicate the shame around it, because nobody just wakes up one day and says, oh, I want to have a bunch of failed relationships. I want to be really lousy at adult relationships. No, there are reasons for it.
Yeah. I was talking to someone out here, and I was saying I was going to talk about codependency, and the person was like, oh, what's that? They understood what the meaning is, but not quite in a relationship setting. How do you know if you're a couple in love and both of you are desperately in love? How do you know you're in that relationship? You're in a codependent relationship.
Okay, well, I can talk about the difference between love addiction and codependency. I'll do that, and then we can sort of talk about trauma bonds.
Okay.
So they're both lifestyle addictions, and they both focus on looking on the outside of themselves to fill their empty void. So this is just a definition of love addiction, codependency. Love addicts are looking for a person to take away their insatiable need to be loved. Like I talked about, they want validation, they want to be acknowledged, they want to be loved. Codependents can also look to persons to be loved, but they also can go to places or things to give them purpose. But they both are terrified of abandon and will do anything to hold on to to a relationship so they don't have to experience the painful abandonment feelings which they received from living with people early on that weren't emotionally or maybe physically not there for them. They might have been neglected or abused. My case, I was premature. Codependents take it to another level though. So they'll control, they'll manipulate, and they'll enable a person so that they don't lose this person. I was so terrified of another divorce, from my ex-alcoholic. I did everything I thought to save him, which of course, ultimately I realized I had no control over that. There's almost nothing that is too much trouble or takes too much time or is too expensive to help another person we're involved with to avoid a breakup. We're willing to wait and hope and try harder to please. We'll take far more than 50% of the responsibility, the guilt, and the blame in any relationship. And codependent self-esteem is usually critically very low, and deep inside, they believe they have to earn the right to enjoy their life. They have to earn, they have to do something. They have to take care of somebody in order to earn their love. And when codependent control other people in situations, they think that they're being helpful, but really they're not being helpful. They're actually allowing another person to avoid the consequences of their behavior. But going back to your question about people are in love, is this a codependent, love addicted relationship? Well, it is if they are your whole life and you have nothing else going on in your life and you're addicted to them. And if they're ill, if they're a narcissist or they're toxic or they're an addict and you're spending all your time trying to change, fix, control, and manipulate them, you're probably in a really unhealthy relationship. And often these relationships become trauma bonded, where you both are like two little babies in a crib together, and you have similar abandonment issues, you have similar issues from the past, and so you rely on each other in a very unhealthy way. And you'll know this if your life just is kind of becomes all about them and nothing else. And that's really the telltale sign.
No, I love that, because a lot of people go through that and not knowing that they're going through that. And I love what you said, Sherry, is about the people tend to give more. They're not realizing they're doing it. They're giving more.
And they lose themselves. That's a big part of it. You don't have a sense of self. You don't know what your preferences are. You don't know what you want. And so you are much more vulnerable to be with someone who is going to abuse you, because you don't have a sense of self. Now, I'm going to say there is the caveat where you can just be a very nice, loving, compassionate, loyal, generous person. You might not have had any early trauma, and then you end up with an addict or a narcissist, and suddenly you find yourself in a codependent relationship. So you don't have to have early trauma, but it's usually that early trauma that has you go into these empty relationships because you feel empty because you didn't get what you needed. But again, there can be someone out there saying, well, I had a great childhood, and I totally get that. And if you did, but you're just a very kind, loving, loyal, compassionate person, and you have all these wonderful personality traits, but then you end up in this really unhealthy, toxic relationship. And then you find yourself in that trauma bonded situation.
Yeah, no, I love the second bit, because I think so many people fall into that category. And they're so kind, loving, and not knowing they had a perfect home, perfect life, everything was going well for them, but they fall into this person that becomes makes their life codependent, and they can't let go of the relationship. But and another thing you always talk about is the narcissist behavior. And one thing I know, women tend to fall for these narcissist behavior, narcissist men. What leads women? What draws a woman to go for that kind of man? And how can they let go?
Okay, so first I'll just talk a little bit about early trauma, because that is a big part of that piece. Again, it doesn't have to be, but when you don't receive what you need as a child, your emotional growth is stunted. And if you were neglected or abused or had emotionally unavailable parents, or you became like a little adult, maybe your mother or father treated you like an adult, so you became parentified, this will set you up for really difficult relationships. Because victims of trauma don't have a sense of who they are. They have a false reality of themselves. They don't really know who their real self is. They don't trust their emotions because they can't access what their true feelings are. And the reason being is, if you were invisible as a child due to neglect, abuse, or unavailable parenting, there's no one to acknowledge who you are. So you will learn at an early age that feelings don't count because you weren't heard or validated anyway. So you become very other focused. You learn to focus on everything else around you rather than your own needs. which is at the heart and the foundation of discovering who your true self is knowing what you need, what you want. And if you don't have an intimate relationship, like I talked about earlier, or a connection with yourself, you're going to be very vulnerable to toxic relationship. And it's going to be very difficult to have a true intimate relationship. And all your relationships are going to be other focused. And at the heart of that is codependency and love addiction. So for instance, for your question about falling for a toxic relationship, that's really easy because they come in, they do this thing called love bombing. They tell you how wonderful you are. They give you all this validation, all this acknowledgement. My own mother fell into that. My father had died. He was a wonderful man. They had a wonderful marriage, and a sociopath predator, narcissist met her, and he said all the right things. You're beautiful. And she just got sucked right in. He was homeless guy, but he had all this quote charm, which I didn't find him charming, but my mother did apparently. And they moved right in, and he financially, emotionally, spiritually, sexually abused her. We eventually were able to get a restraining order, get him out of the house. And my poor mother, had to be 5150, which is called a hold, because she was out of her mind. I mean, this man was just awful, but she was, almost had sort of that Stockholm syndrome. He just basically took her hostage, and we really had nothing to do with her because he wouldn't let us see her. So it was just a really awful thing. And I tell that story because it can happen to anybody, and it can happen if you're old, it can happen when you're young, but you got to watch out for that love bombing. And if you're someone who has an emptiness inside and you don't like yourself and you have low self-esteem, and if somebody starts telling you all these wonderful things, or maybe you're somebody that's in your late 30s and 40, your biological clock is ticking, and someone says, "Oh, I'll have a baby with you." And, you get sucked in. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable how these guys, and it can be a woman too. Women are just as good. There are just as many female narcissists. I mean, listen, toxic relationships are exhausting and they're frustrating. And people may feel like they're doomed to stay in these unhealthy and miserable relationships. And it's so easy for love addicts to get into these relationships because they're repeating that early trauma into their adult relationships. So rather than relying on a facade of love to fill the emotional voids, they need to identify healthier strategies to manage their daily feelings and stress, which means they've got to have healthier boundaries. They've got to look at their self-esteem and increasing their self-esteem. They need to process their childhood trauma, like I did with a trauma therapist, or someone like myself who does somatic work with my clients. You need to look at the neglect and the abuse and the abandonment, and you have to develop assertiveness skills.
Yeah. When you talked about your mother and eventually she got the whole thing sorted out. Normally, when people go through this, I think the biggest problem they have when they go through a bad relationship, someone who's narcissist or whatever they might be, how do you heal from something like this? How do you find yourself? How do you, if you're codependent on someone and you realize this is happening to you, how do you find yourself to get out of that relationship? What are some of the advice or tips you would give someone who realizes this is happening to me? I need to get out of this. This narcissist is around me. I need to not just get out, I also need to heal. What are your advice for that?
Well, first of all, and just being here, everyone, I want to let you know, just listening to this podcast or this interview, I think is a great step, because now you have an awareness, and you can only make a decision to change when you know there's a problem. You really need to stop looking for the external solutions for your problems and start really exploring, what are your fears? What is this feeling of emptiness, this low self-esteem? Learning to really get out of denial, because so often we have the intuition. I always knew that these people were wrong for me, but I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to be abandoned. I didn't want to be rejected. So I just avoided the truth. So I lived kind of in an illusion. I settled for less. So we have to learn not to do those things, move out of the denial, really examine our early suppressed trauma in childhood, start self-parenting yourself, do some inner work in terms of, inner child work, adult self-work, work with a therapist that does trauma work like myself, someone that can do somatic work, getting you back in your body so you can become available to you and connect back to you. So you'll be more aware when somebody comes in that's love bombing you. You'll know, oh no, your red flag. Really start becoming more loving and forgiving and compassionate to yourself. Use the pain to grow. use it to prepare for a healthy relationship. Learn to trust in yourself, learn to let go, find a great therapist, or find an online support group. I was going to talk a little bit about my program. It's a membership. It's called Wake Up Recovery. And until September 30th, I'm offering it at 6 months free. So it's actually only $13 a month. And I offer this because there's so many people that can't afford therapy. So it's, I do a once a month group coaching session. And then there's a 10-week core course that they take to work through their love addiction or their toxic relationship. And then every month I put in a new masterclass. So it's unbelievable resource for anybody that kind of wants to step into their process of recovery. Of course, if they really have early trauma, and this is not, this is information, this is education, there is some group coaching, then they might want to hire somebody, an individual therapist. But the most important thing about my tribe is that people realize they're not alone. They're there to support each other. Because that can be one of the most healing things to turn your life around, just knowing that you're not alone.
Absolutely. I think as you have people there that you could easily talk to that will help you through the process. You're an author. You're not just a therapist, you're also an author. You've written a best-selling book on Amazon, Love Smacked. What led you on this process to write this book, to tell the story, to help people who are going through this process? And
I knew it needed to be like some kind of book/workbook where people could actually do some work, within the book, not just read a bunch of stuff, but actually dive deep, dig a little deeper. The book, it was in my head for like 20 years. I mean, it just was in my head, rolling around. And then finally, after my divorce, it was quite, what do we call it? What do you call it? When you meet the soul, the dark night of the soul. So I had this dark night of the soul. My father, who I adored, died. I went through that divorce. I went through the alcohol abuse with my ex, which is completely traumatic. My other dog died. I was just lost, and I just had to do this work. And so once I started doing the work, I realized I've got to get out there. I've got to share my message. People need to hear from me. And they need to hear from me not only because I'm a therapist, and I'm not ashamed that this work still needed to be done, even though I was a therapist working with people. I still hadn't done my love addiction work. And I want people to know it could happen to anybody, and there's always support, and you're not alone. And that's why I created the program and I wrote the book.
Final question, anyone who's going to listen to this conversation, going through on any of these things, what are your methods that you use that really help your clients to navigate their pain and find their joy? What are some of your methods that you use?
Well, the first is somatic experiencing, which is actually a very titrated method of releasing toxic energy. We have a fight, flight, or freeze response. So we want to remove the frozen energy that's been stuck in our lives because of trauma. Sometimes I do some tapping, which kind of gets the trauma out immediately. The somatic work is a little bit slower of a process, but it's absolutely mandatory that you do this work. Because if you're making bad decisions, it's because you're stuck somewhere in your life, and we can't just talk it out. We have to actually energetically get that out. We have to have an understanding of it, and then we have to energetically get that toxicity out of our bodies that we experienced. So I do the tapping, the somatic work. I do, traditional psychotherapy, talk therapy. I'm very goal oriented. So we really, I'm also a life coach. So we really get to well, what's our goal here? What do we want to accomplish? And then I do a lot of stuff with attachment styles, really digging into are you an anxious attachment? Are you a love avoidant? Why do you keep picking unavailable love avoidant type people? So I do a lot of stuff with that. And I think that's, I'm kind of have a, kind of a treasure trove of a toolbox, really.
And anyone who wants to get hold of you, Sherry, to discuss more about this program, more about learning how to get out of a toxic relationship, learning to, finance, they might be in a toxic relationship with their finance and toxic relationship with their dieting. Anyone who's trying to get hold of you, how did they get in touch?
So they can go to sherrygaba.com, SherryGaba.com, if you want to put that in a link on your website, and they can make an appointment there. they can join my Wake Up Recovery program, which is a very low cost, but just like I said, an amazing toolbox of resources to deal with this stuff. And they can buy my book, Love Smacked, on Amazon. So
Yeah.
easy. I also have an Instagram feed, which is very, very popular, called Codependency Curious.
Mhm.
And I post a lot of videos there, a lot of posts, very educational. I'd love for you to join my feed, Codependency Curious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sharon, because I think anyone who's
man.
listening, I've learned so much about this and understand more about codependency and understanding as well. It's not just someone who's been in traumatic relationship from childhood. It's also someone who's just loving, passionate, just fell in the wrong hand. Thank you for this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I put in a lot of information in a very short period of time, but I think
Yes,
people like.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thanks.